we shall go ahead and get started. And I believe that some people will still be trickling in as we do that. We had a good number of registrations. So, but we don't want to lose too much time because we don't have, we only have a short hour, but in any event, thank you so much for being here. As I think as everyone knows, I'm Dean Anita Krug, and I always really love this event, our annual Palmer Lecture to honor this year's recipient of the Chicago Kent Roy C. Palmer Civil Liberties Prize. And I want to tell you just a little bit about the prize. It was established in 2007 by Chicago Kent alumnus Roy C. Palmer and his wife Susan M. Palmer to honor exemplary works of scholarship exploring threats to or supports of the liberal democratic constitutional order. The prize is designed to encourage and reward debates among scholars on current issues affecting the rights of individuals and the responsibilities of governments throughout the world. Roy Palmer was a lawyer and a real estate developer, a 1962 honors graduate of Chicago Kent, and a member of Chicago Kent's Board of Advisors. In 2012, he received the Chicago Kent Alumni Association's Distinguished Service Award, and in 2013, he was named one of our 125 alumni of distinction. Before his death in 2017, he and Mrs. Palmer were active in numerous civic, social, and philanthropic organizations. Although Susan Palmer typically travels to Chicago for this event, she was unfortunately unable to join us this year. So before introducing our speaker, I want to thank our Palmer Prize Selection Committee, consisting of Professor Steve Heyman, Professor Mark Rosen, and Professor Chris Schmidt, each of whom carefully read each of the many, many submissions we received this year. So today, joining our list of distinguished scholars who have won the Palmer Prize is James Davison Hunter, the LaBrosse Levinson Distinguished Professor of Religion, Culture, and Social Theory at the University of Virginia, which he joined in 1983. Since 1995, he has also been the Executive Director of the Institute for Advanced Studies on Culture, also at the University of Virginia. We are honoring Professor Hunter for his most recent book, Democracy and Solidarity on the Cultural Roots of America's Political Crisis, which Yale University Press published in 2024. In the selection committee's words, the book offers a diagnosis, a warning, and a call to revitalize the unifying cultural resources that have made democracy in America possible. And provides ambitious but practical recommendations identifying the kinds of cultural resources needed to survive the crisis we face. Clearly, this is a very timely book. Not surprisingly, though, Democracy and Solidarity is only the latest in Professor Hunter's lengthy bibliography. He has written or edited numerous books and published a wide range of essays, articles, and reviews, all variously concerned with the problem of meaning and moral order in a time of political and cultural change in American life. Perhaps his most well-known book to date is Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America, which he published in 1991, and which gave rise to culture war, a term with which we are all familiar. Over the years, Professor Hunter has presented his research findings to audiences on NPR and C-SPAN, at the National Endowment for the Arts, and at dozens of colleges and universities around the country, and he has won numerous awards for them. He has also been a consultant to the White House, the Bicentennial Committee for the U.S. Constitution, the Pew Charitable Trust, and the National Commission on Civic Renewal. We are thrilled that he is with us today, and with that, I welcome Professor Hunter to the front.
I should add one thing to the long resume. Still a disappointment to my mother. Dean Krug, thank you very much for the warm welcome and the introduction. I want to thank the Palmer family, Susan Palmer in particular, for this award. I'm greatly honored by it and also encouraged. I also want to thank the committee, Professors Schmidt, Rosen, and Heyman, for the time they put in to read all of these works. And last night we had a great dinner, terrific dinner that included Chris and Mark, but also Andrew Shejum. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that.
Yeah, close enough, yes.
Okay. And then Jacob Shiner Briggs as well. It was great fun in a nerdy way. So let me just launch in, but one other thing. I want to thank all of you. I've been in the biz for a long time, and I know how busy all of you are. And for you to take time out of your busy schedule to come to this lecture means a lot to me. And I hope I can reward you with some provocative thoughts. I'll launch right in. In 1838, amid the first stirrings of the great national crisis that would take his life and bring him immortal fame, the young Abraham Lincoln argued before an audience in Springfield, Illinois, that the United States was impervious to every threat but one. All of the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, he declared, and the proem to what is now called his Lyceum Address. With all the treasure of the earth, our own accepted, in their military chests, with a Bonaparte, for a commander could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge, a trial of 1,000 years. The danger the young country faced, however, was one that no oceans or mountains could protect against. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. Lincoln said, as a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Lincoln was right about America's natural and institutional defenses. Since the conclusion of the War of 1812, no foreign power has seriously menaced the freedom of the United States, but he was also right about the risk of national suicide. His prophecy was most obviously vindicated in the Civil War, which was born out of a clash between two systems of morals that no ethical argument, theological exegesis, or political compromise could reconcile. That conflict ended in a decisive military victory for Lincoln's side, followed by a long, slow, cultural and political struggle to establish the emancipatory promises of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, in fact, as well as by right. But our vast and varied country, with its world-shaping power, was always destined to find new objects of struggle, new existential crises, and it has. 34 years ago, I introduced the concept of the culture wars to public discussion in a book entitled Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America. I didn't invent the concept. Otto von Bismarck did that in the 1870s at the time of German unification. But I did see its relevance to developments in America's political culture in the last third of the 20th century. At the time, the insight was counterintuitive. Through most of the 20th century, political conflict was defined mostly by the dynamics of political economy. The salient cleavages of left and right, Democrat and Republican, were defined by the interest of corporations against those of labor unions, the working class against the managerial class. In broader terms, between free market economics against various forms of economic collectivism and social welfare. But something was clearly changing. By the 1970s, the dynamics of social and political conflict were beginning to shift away from the pragmatic problems of addressing issues of economic consolidation and redistribution to the symbolic politics of so-called cultural issues: abortion, women's rights, gay rights, family values, gender, funding for the arts, school curricula, church-state matters, the bias of the media, the composition of the courts, immigration, race, and so on. The shift entailed a redefinition of identity and purpose of the parties as they positioned themselves on these issues. And not just parties and the functioning agencies of the state, but every institution of civil society: the family, public education, religion, higher education, philanthropy, the arts, journalism and the media, science, technology, medicine, and community organizations. Every part of public and political life was becoming, and now has been, subsumed and politicized by the logics of the culture war in ways that cumulatively amount to a struggle to define the meaning of America. On its own terms, the nature of this conflict was something new, and its challenge to democracy was something I intuited to be serious indeed. But how serious? America has always had political conflict. We have always been defined by difference and diversity. There has always been faction. The founders anticipated it. How is this different? Obviously, a lot of ink has been spilled on the topic of polarization and the culture wars over the last 3 decades, some of it mine, and most of it has been journalistic, though, exploring how the culture wars played out on the surface of social and political life, in this event or that, in this affair or that, with these people or those. Far less has gone into the deeper questions about the nature, sources, evolution, and consequences of this conflict. So I return to the issue by approaching it through its antithesis, to think of the problem from its opposite side. It's a tried and true method of structuralism. We know what day is because we know what night is. We know light because we know darkness. We know youth because we know old age. Perhaps we can understand more about the deep fissures of conflict in American political life and its consequences, its seriousness, by understanding its inverse. Perhaps by learning more about what has held us together, we can know more about what drives us apart. This is actually a quandary that takes us back to the beginning of the Republic. Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson proposed E pluribus unum as the national motto for the Great Seal of the United States in 1776. But even then, one out of many was less an accomplishment than a puzzle to figure out, a puzzle that would require solving anew with every generation. So this afternoon, what I would like to talk about is the problem of solidarity. Why solidarity, not consensus? How is solidarity constituted? What is its relationship between culture and politics? I want to offer a further reflection on the procedural republic that has, for generations, been the backdrop for the work of law, policy, and politics. And finally, I want to conclude with a reflection on where the culture war has now taken us. So what makes us cohere as a society? What's the glue, if anything, that binds us together? To simply function at a bare minimum, every institution on the face of the planet must have something that will bind it together. A marriage, a family that doesn't have some common values or some common language or some common projects will invariably fall apart. The same, of course, is true of a church, a synagogue, a mosque. It is true as well in a corporation or a nonprofit or a law school. And so it is with a government and a nation. Thus, however bitterly polarized disputes over certain policy issues may be, And however ideologically, economically, or racially factionalized we as a people may become, any kind of meaningful democratic politics presupposes at least some minimally shared understandings and commitments that are prior to political action. The idea of a set of shared understandings and sensibilities that contain our differences and disagreements is not an abstract formulary, but a basic requirement of democratic life. It's tempting to associate these shared understandings, this unum, as a formal consensus over the centrality of the Constitution and the rule of law. To be sure, a certain degree of consensus is necessary among those who make and enforce the law and procedures for determining the law, policymakers, judges, law enforcement, and the like. Otherwise, the rule of law would have no meaning. But its applicability tends to be narrow, limited. It tends to be limited to those who are technically and administratively proficient in the law. The word consensus itself is narrow for another reason. It suggests rational agreement. It places great store on reason and rationality to the exclusion of the affective and sociological dimensions of human experience. To apply the concept of rational consensus to the general public may be a good idea, but as a rule, it sets untenably high expectations on the public. It also misconstrues the nature of how human beings actually come together in social life. A more useful term for approaching the problem of the unum is through the concept of solidarity. It's more useful because it recognizes that there are other things that bind us together besides our capacity to rationally argue, deliberate, and forge agreements. It further recognizes the human capacity to come together in ways that transcend or relativize any particular disagreements. I may disagree with my family about nearly everything, but my love for them ultimately makes any of our disagreements less urgent and maybe even immaterial. I may argue with my neighbors about politics and argue vociferously, but if there's a threat to our neighborhood, a flood, a storm, or a gang of thieves, we'll be side by side working together to protect our families, friends, and neighborhood because we share something at stake. And a business person may come to dislike his or her business partner, but the promise of profit from the sale of their company will tend to keep any animosity in check for the time being. The power of solidarity, then, is found in the unspoken, often vague or fuzzy resonances of shared identity, shared affections, shared challenges, and or a shared destiny. In all of these cases, rational agreement rooted in affirmative principles and procedures is largely irrelevant. And so this complex, sometimes contradictory array of elements provides sources of a common recognition, a sense of we-ness or usness that carries with it an element of mutual obligation. In a democracy, solidarity in this more capacious sense provides a framework of cohesion within which legitimate political debate, discourse, and action can take place. This kind of sociology is actually implicit within the concept of a constitution. When people speak of a constitution today, they are usually referring to a framework of laws and formal institutions, the rules governing the relatively small part of a people's common life that's concerned with the coercive or administrative part of the state. But I'm told by my classicist friends that in classical Greece and in Roman thought, the words corresponding to our notion of the Constitution had a much broader reference as the nature, character, and condition of things, a settled arrangement, the temper and substance of things. It was taken for granted in the ancient world that laws, opinions, and sentiments were inseparable, and that peoples were bound together by characteristic ideas, dispositions, habits, practices, and moral commitments. I would contend that at its founding, America had a constitution in this fuller sense of the term, long before it was formalized into a framework of laws and formal institutions. In other words, there was a latent constitution that preceded the manifest and formal constitution. As Michael Oakeshott acknowledged in his this important distinction when he wrote that, and I quote, "While politics can give expression to and defend a particular social order, it cannot direct it. Political activity may have given us the Magna Carta, but it did not give us the contents of these documents, which came from a stratum of social thought far too deep to be influenced by the actions of politicians." End quote. So too in America, political activity may have given us the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights, but it did not invent the value of individual freedom or the idea of representative self-government or the value of toleration or the concepts of justice, equality, decency, civility, or the temperament to long for these things. These too came from a stratum of social thought far too deep to be influenced by the actions of politicians. This is to say that solidarity is cultural before it is political. If there was a political solidarity in the past, it's because it rested upon common assumptions about the nature of a good society. If there was a democratic way through the conflicts of the past, it's because it could draw from the cultural sources of common hopes and a common vocabulary for articulating those hopes in ways that transcended those impasses and ultimately led us beyond them. Thus, long before democracy is a set of political institutions, it is more fundamentally a shared moral imaginary and complex of social practices. In America, this moral imaginary and those social practices were drawn from our particular adaptation of the Enlightenment, the great intellectual and cultural revolution of the 18th to the 19th centuries, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Ours was a hybrid Enlightenment that drew from the intellectual and cultural resources of the English and Scottish Enlightenment and its rationalism, the Whig tradition in British philosophy and history, Lockean individualism, and not least the varieties of Calvinism that proliferated in America at the time. From these sources emerged an ethical vision for the reconstitution of public life, a vision of greater freedom, equality, and toleration, but also a vision of interdependence, sympathy, mutuality, benevolence, and such civic virtues as loyalty to the community, knowledge of public affairs, civility, and restraint in the conduct of deliberation. This was true of all the great democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, but especially so in America. The new American Constitution, in its fullest sense, would reflect a special kind of intentionality. Perhaps more than any form of government before it, the American order would embody an abstract ethical ideal. This ethical imaginary was novel to history, which is why the founders called it a novus ordo seclorum, a new order for the ages, a new beginning for humanity. These cultural sources not only made these ideas and ideals intelligible to ordinary citizens, but in the process, they provided sources for solidarity or cohesion in a diverse population that could contain the public's many internal disagreements, at least many of them. How? Its power was in large measure its opacity, which allowed different individuals, factions, communities, and traditions to read their own particular creeds, histories, national cultures, and interests into it. That opacity could contain and accommodate many of the contentious differences that prevailed at the time. The problem with America's hybrid enlightenment was that it was beset from contradictions from the very outset. We promised freedom to all, but then denied freedom to large swaths of the population. We promised equality to all, but refused equality to vast portions of the American people. We promised to tolerate differences, but then were deeply intolerant of many of the differences that are constitutive of life, meaning, and identity. And these contradictions played out widely, not only against the Aboriginal tribes of the continent and African-born slaves and their descendants, but also against Roman Catholics, Mormons, Jews. Ultimately, the questions at stake in these contradictions was, who is an American and who is included in the American project? The larger part of the story I tell in Democracy and Solidarity is the story of how, over many generations, we Americans worked through, the technical term actually, the German Durcharbeiten, how we worked through the difficult contradictions inherent to the hybrid enlightenment in the effort to create and sustain a more perfect union. Through the tense, conflictual, and sometimes violent process of working through these differences, the hybrid enlightenment evolved. It became something different than it was before, but all in ways that were still recognizable to the past and in ways that continue to serve as yet a vital source of ongoing solidarity until the present. The questions and contradictions of American life continue unabated. We're still asking the question, who is an American, worthy of its rights, protections, and responsibilities? We're still working through the boundaries of tolerable difference, still trying to determine national identity and purpose in a late modern context. The problem is that we no longer have the resources to work through them democratically. The cultural antecedents out of which liberal democracy in America was forged, and in that, in an evolving measure and form, have sustained its vitality over generations, have largely dissolved, and all the efforts to reconfigure and revivify those cultural sources are proving profoundly deficient. The dissolution of those cultural antecedents, that latent constitution I keep referring to, has left behind a vacuum of meaning and order that is felt in every sphere of life, from politics to religion, to education, to entertainment, to the life of our cities, to sex, dating, and marriage. In each of these spheres, all of which must be in some good, sort of a good order for people to live happy, to flourish, to have dignified lives, instability, confusion, dread, and bitter conflict reign. There exists no shared ethic, no system of norms, no architecture of meaning to moderate the pursuit of self-interest, to manage the tensions among different social groups, or to lend grace and assurance to the intricate dance of common life in a complex and diverse society. And no shared language or logics by which antagonists could settle their disputes, much less reasonably address larger questions about America's future. Neither faith nor reason, nor their evolving Enlightenment synthesis can now resolve concrete and enduring political questions made pressing by the advance of modernity. Who can enjoy the benefits of freedom? Equality for whom? What are the limits of toleration? And on what grounds do we reconcile various personal, private, and factional interests with the public good? And perhaps most elusively, what is the public good in the first place? In such a world, a thicker form of solidarity would become on its own terms impossible. But what about a thin solidarity? A proceduralism that valorized reason and rules of procedure for making collective decisions. Would this be adequate to the text? As we now know, reason itself is in the dock. Proceduralism emerged at a moment in history when it was becoming clear that any agreement on transcendent truths would be hard to come by. The decline of organized religion and the expansion of pluralism in modernity rendered this turn almost inevitable. Where else would one find solidarity but in the process of political decision-making, in the shared commitment to a method for working out disagreement? A set of rational rules followed by rational actors for living together peacefully. As early as the early modern period, the so-called social contract tradition sought to ground political legitimacy in a free agreement among members of society. Although many social contract theorists retained foundationalist elements in their thinking, Locke, for example, believed that political authorities must respect the natural rights that God had given man. The very idea of grounding political legitimacy in a contract, a voluntary agreement among ordinary, rational human beings, already represented a decisive move toward proceduralism. Proceduralist political philosophers ever since Locke have hoped that this more down-to-earth concept of legitimacy might allow people who disagree fundamentally about eternal truths to share a country and a government in peace. The question of solidarity was central to the intellectual project of the great political philosopher John Rawls. He put it this way: how is it possible for there to exist over time a just and stable society of free and equal citizens who remain profoundly divided by reasonable religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines? In response, he developed and articulated a relatively thin proceduralism in his 1971 opus, A Theory of Justice. His argument was intended to describe and defend a liberal, rights-based political order in terms that would be acceptable to any reasonable person, not just those with a prior commitment to liberal values. In this way, he hoped to secure widespread political agreement among people with conflicting moral cosmologies. But the procedural republic always depended upon certain latent assumptions about the universal adequacy of mind-independent reason and the legitimacy of the rule of law and procedure. Even the theorists of contemporary proceduralism understood that this form of solidarity was too thin, without an implicit culture that would underwrite it. Rawls, for example, spoke of the importance of settled convictions, that was his term, behind his theory of justice. The shared fund of implicitly recognized basic ideas and principles is how he defined it. Habermas also made repeated references to the necessity of a large background consensus for his version of proceduralism that would be rooted in shared intersubjective life worlds for the stability of democratic discourse. Michael Sandel, who celebrated this time last year, defines the public philosophy in these very terms: the political theory implicit in our practice, the assumptions about citizenship and freedom that inform our public life. Many operating within the proceduralist camp have assumed that even in the natural evolution of social life, the settled convictions that make sense of democracy's rituals and procedures would remain settled, that the background consensus of shared assumptions and implicit agreements that would make discursive practice fair and reasonable would remain stable. But those settled convictions upon which proceduralism depends have not remained settled. The background consensus upon which the procedural republic has depended has not remained stable. And because this is the case, we face a major epistemic crisis. The cultural sources of both thick and thin forms of solidarity have dissolved. Upon what do we ground any claims to a common good? How are we to resolve our differences to achieve common ends? I have heard it said that the present epistemic crisis can be blamed on the soft relativism of postmodern scholarship in deconstructing reason and rationality and the Enlightenment itself. But the radical skepticism of intellectuals has percolated into the general public and embraced by those who have never heard of, much less read, Nietzsche, Foucault, Derrida, de Man, or Rorty. Their skepticism is now ubiquitous. Nearly everyone sees the hypocrisy of intellectual and scientific authority. Nearly everyone doubts the reasoned arguments of their leaders, and that in turn, it turns out, is one of the keys to understanding the epistemic crisis that is distinctive about our political moment. I've also heard it said that ordinary citizens are just not capable of serious reasoning anymore. That ordinary folk have become more stupid or more gullible than in times past. But as Christopher Lasch has pointed out, ordinary citizens have no real institutional alternative to the consumption of hyperbole, spin, distortion, and lies. For the average person navigating this baffling symbolic landscape, what gets filtered tends to be the information that reinforces their own understanding of the world, an understanding shared with anonymous others in a simulated community. The reality is that the deeper sources of our epistemic crisis is an informational ecosystem spawned by the new communications technologies and the market dynamics by which they proliferate that renders reason, truth, evidence, and evidence beside the point. This is an ecosystem in which manipulation, duplicity, and bigotry find little to no obstruction. Indeed, a large study of Twitter users showed that false stories circulate at a rate much faster and more widely than true stories. In other words, this is a systemic problem in which all sides are implicated, and because of this, the line between truth and falsehood, fact and fiction, real and unreal, reasonable and unreasonable has now become nebulous at best. That between half and 2/3 of adults in America now regularly get their news through social media means that this problem will remain entrenched for as long as this media environment exists. Against this background, the hyperbole, spin, fear-mongering, distortion, and the like that have long characterized political actors, politicians, public officials, and parties becomes magnified to the point that the distinction between truth and falsehood becomes irrelevant. What matters isn't truth, but effectiveness. As the former Senate Majority Leader, Harry Reid, Democrat of Nevada, put it, after having been criticized for fabricating a lie against Mitt Romney, who was running for president at the time, that he had not paid his taxes for a decade, he responded, well, they can call it whatever they want. Romney didn't win, did he? In an equally revealing moment in the 2016 election, Newt Gingrich, Republican, dismissed FBI crime statistics showing that crime of all sorts was in decline, saying that, as a political candidate, I'll go with what people feel and let you, the CNN reporter, go with the theoreticians. For political actors, the incentive is simply to generate momentum around political versions of unreality the American public can be induced to accept. And there is no structure of accountability within this larger communications ecosystem to diminish its effect. And that effect is a kind of epistemic chaos. From this perspective, we see that Trump is not the cause, but rather just an artifact of the corruptions of the larger public and political culture around us. What distinguishes him, of course, however, is that he understands this political culture better than most and knows how to deepen that epistemic chaos with a brazen intentionality, the net effect of which can only be the further dissolution of the legitimacy of liberal proceduralism and the remaining structures of affirmative solidarity it has provided. It's very important to acknowledge at this point that a weakened and thin procedural solidarity was still resilient enough to ensure an effective, even if ugly, transfer of power in 2020, but not strong enough to be peaceful, as the violent protests on the Capitol on January 6, 2021 demonstrated. It was robust enough to restore relatively stable governance in the years following Trump's first term of office, but not stable enough for the Biden presidency to be seen as legitimate by large segments of the American population. America's written constitution, as I say, remains intact and legally in force. But the broader and deeper liberal democratic constitution, the unspoken assumptions and undiscussed practices that sustain and stabilize formal liberal democratic politics in the long run, is in disarray. It is the collapse of that broader and deeper constitution, sensed by all, that requires us to ask, what is the status of procedural solidarity? How strong is the institutional foundation to the rule of law and to the canons of reason that underwrite it? Not long ago, it would have been preposterous to have thought these questions, much less posed them in a public forum. But that challenge to the rule of law, to the independence of the judiciary and other agencies of the government, to the civil liberties of citizens and legal residents are coming from the executive branch, requires us to ask them, that is, these questions. It is an active debate. You see, a post-truth democracy is a contradiction in terms. It would mean that a nation is ungovernable. The dissolution of any agreement over what constitutes small t truth or facts or reality or the means by which we can determine what constitutes these things would now seem to be a given, and there would seem at this point to be no authority or logic or shared premises or neutral observational language, as Thomas Kuhn put it, that could arrive collectively at agreement. Historically, the culture war emerged simultaneously with the dissolution of the hybrid Enlightenment, the cultural substructure of liberal democracy. This historical fact reinforces a central point made earlier, but now in the reverse. If Americans are divided politically, it is because they are divided culturally at this level. If there is little or no common political ground today, it is because there are few, if any, common assumptions about the nature of a good society that underwrite a shared political life. If we cannot find a way beyond our political stalemates, it's because we cannot find the cultural sources of common hopes or a common vocabulary for articulating those hopes in ways that transcend those impasses and that ultimately lead us beyond them. This means that the crisis of democracy is not found in our polarization, however deep it may be. The problem is that we lack the cultural resources to work through what divides us. The historical framing of this question brings into relief the larger significance of the puzzle that we have to solve. If, in fact, the frameworks of meaning and interpretation and the cultural logics that defined the hybrid Enlightenment, and in turn created the conditions for the birth of liberal democracy and in some debatable form or measure, has sustained it over time, what now? What happens when the former loses its authority? Can an Enlightenment-era political institution, liberal democracy, survive and thrive in a post-Enlightenment culture? Is there anything from the hybrid Enlightenment project that remains, that's salvageable or renewable? What, if anything, can be reconstructed from this deconstructed culture? Or if, for some, salvaging the hybrid Enlightenment project is neither possible sociologically, nor desirable politically or ethically, then what cultural resources will fund liberal democracy going forward? The answers to these questions are not obvious. Neither is it obvious that there are answers. We have long wanted to believe not only in the durability and stability of American democratic institutions, but also in their long-term vitality. Democracy in America has survived for 2.5 centuries, meeting and mediating severe disruptions to the social order along the way. Why shouldn't it survive well into the future? Perhaps it will, but in no way is it guaranteed, and we should not assume it will. So why does this matter? And I'll end here. It matters because the authoritarian impulse becomes manifest in the attempt to address the absence of solidarity. You see, if solidarity cannot be generated organically, it will be imposed coercively. This is why the culture war has devolved into warring hegemonic projects. The culture war is now a struggle to impose an enduring solidarity precisely because we have given up trying to generate cohesion democratically. This means the means by which we engage each other are Nietzschean. It is through a competing will to power, rooted in the cultural logics of grievance and revenge. Ultimately, the cultural logics of grievance are cultural logics of annihilation. Annihilation, in other words, is not an accidental feature of political life in late modernity, but foundational to its nature. It's not incidental to our cultural politics, but its essence. Within the cultural logics of grievance, cancellation, whether from the left or from the right, the cultural logics of grievance are the point. Annihilation, cancellation is the point. And that's what national suicide could look like. I'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Professor Hunter, for that fascinating and sobering lecture. We have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion. Who would like to start? Please.
Hold on just a moment, if you would.
We're recording, so we want to make sure that everybody can.
Okay. I haven't read the book yet. I'm looking forward to it once I get my library credit. But one thing that I was really curious about when you were talking about, particularly the bit about sort of like tech revolution, information overload, did you focus a lot when you were researching this on like other technological information revolutions and like their effects on like?
Not for this book, I have in the past.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you.
So I have a question, maybe a follow on from our conversation last night, but I was thinking about during your talk and after our discussion last night about deliberative Democrats and their various projects, like the idea of Bruce Ackerman had this idea of having a public holiday, a national holiday for voting purposes, and there are others who describe procedures for encouraging deliberation as a way of constructing solidarity. Are you optimistic about those projects after your work on this book, or are you a pessimist?
Look, I mean, the fact is very few people do pessimism better than me. But to get to know me, very few people do hope better than me. So I think there's always hope. And I think despair is simply off the table. There are over 400 active projects in America right now that are trying to bridge the divide. Almost all of them are local, and they are all struggling to scale. Part of the problem is that the cultural logics of serious deliberation are costly. Time, energy, it's exhausting work to do it. And it's not entertaining to watch. Over against the cultural logics of the new communications technologies, which are very entertaining, they are incentivized. The extremism is incentivized. The kind of truncated nature of that discourse is incentivized. You can make money off of these things. And I actually have done like long interviews with some of these people, not for this book, but for another project. So it's a David and Goliath thing. How do you scale up the kind of serious and substantive debate? And it matters. I mean, there are 2 points that I regularly make, and that really must be heard. Culture wars always precede shooting wars. A shooting war doesn't necessarily happen, but you never have a shooting war without a prior culture war, because culture provides the justifications for violence, right? So that's the first point. The second point is liberal democracy. Whatever else it is, it's an agreement that we won't kill each other over our differences. We will work through our differences through talk. The problem is that the way that we talk, especially at the national level, and their seepage into our local communities, is a way of talking that probably inflames even more than it enlightens. But I think we should keep working at it.
So I really liked your point at the end about how like the culture war is like blaming like nationalistic suicide or something like that. And I just want to know like what you think is the solution to that. Do all of us just like grow like thicker skin and like not be offended by anything, or what?
Well, there are 5 steps to the look, if there's a project to engage in, it's a project that will take a minimum of 1.5 generations. I'm fond, I even mentioned this last night, I think to you, Anita, or to the larger dinner group, but I take some hope in the fact that John Locke wrote his essay concerning toleration from Denmark on the run with a price on his head. It was unimaginable to him at that time that the world would be anything different than what it was. And yet 100 years later, Jefferson is citing Locke for the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and it finds its way into the Bill of Rights, and it becomes the law of the land. So there is no short-term solution here. Now, I do believe the new communications technologies can compress the time between creative thought and its distribution to larger publics. So it may not take a century, but we're talking about a reconstitution, not just in a formal sense, the written, codified sense, but more importantly in the cultural sense. And that just takes time. It's a project of formation of leaders, a formation of young people. It's a formation of everyone into a way of thinking. And I am giving a lot of thought to this at this point, but it's, I know enough about the culture wars, having written a lot about it over the years, and that any project like this will get attacked. So you do have to have a thick skin for that.
I'd like to exercise the moderator's privilege to ask you a final question. which is many of the culture wars issues that you mentioned center around the Supreme Court and its decisions that way. Would you say a few words about ways in which the Supreme Court might have contributed to the culture wars and how the court might be able to try to tamp them down or ameliorate them?
So I'm going to repeat something that I said maybe at lunch today, and it's in the book. First of all, I think that one of the main things that's on John Roberts' mind is the legitimacy of the court. I think he's constantly struggling over that. I think he's deeply worried about the independence of the judiciary. And I think he's rightly worried about all of those things. There's a legitimation crisis in the United States that's been going on at least since the early 1960s, and it's been measured every year, multiple times a year. So we know about that. And the courts have stood up pretty well, but less so. The story I tell, and if you've heard this earlier today, my apologies, but it's about the limitations of what the Supreme Court and the judiciary more broadly can do. And the story comes out of the middle of the 19th century when Roger Taney, this Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, wrote the majority opinion on Dred Scott. He was trying to resolve a 30-year culture war on the issue of the equality and inequality of Black humanity. It was a forceful decision from the highest court in the land and from the Chief Justice himself. It didn't work. We're at war a few years later. It's the bloodiest war in American history. Devastating impact on the country. But Lincoln's side won, which is a good thing. And what followed, of course, were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But we also know that those amendments were abrogated. We didn't live into the promise of the Southern slave regime was simply reconstituted under a different name: Jim Crow, lynching, Code Noir, and it was awful. It was just awful. Why? Both in the case of Taney and in the case of the Union winning the war and the amendments, law can't do the work of culture. It's part of the solution. But, you know, Brown v. Board of Education, which is oftentimes invoked as a case where the law was a teacher. It provided an affirmation of the best of what this nation could be and should be at a time when it wasn't still in practice. But what had happened in the meantime was World War II. And in winning the war against fascism, Americans were forced to work together, be on the battlefield together. Probably more work, cultural work, was done through the battlefield than was done anywhere else. And it was in that context we learned to trust one another more than we had. In a way, the cultural work had been done prior to Brown v. Board of Education, which made it stick in ways that it didn't in the middle of the 19th century. The other case, of course, is abortion. Roe v. Wade was imposed on the nation as a consensus for a country that was deeply divided. And as a consequence, the central issue of the culture war over the last 50 years or so has been abortion. It still divides. The Dobbs decision changed the direction of things. It reversed Roe v. Wade, but it hasn't lessened the division at all. In Roe v. Wade, what happened is that the pro-life contingent created workarounds. That's what they did. Right now, the pro-choice side is creating workarounds. So the law is limited in what it can do. Its authority is limited. Even if Roberts is capable of maintaining the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, and good luck to him, I hope he does, it's still limited in what it can accomplish.
Please thank me and please join me.